Well, thanks for coming. It's good to see such a large number of people here. And I want to sort of get you in the mood. I will fly through some of the slides because they're a little bit detailed, and hopefully get you thinking. I think you're probably already thinking because you've come here tonight. So I just want to get you to think and relax a bit. I won't ask the mic to go around, but if you can shout out, what do you see in the picture? Birds in the wheat field. Birds in the wheat field, yeah, very close to the title.
Like two suns. Looks like two suns.
Two suns. Anything else?
So East Main just running through the field.
I think that painting was even before her time. Thank you, great. Okay, so I use this actually as a launch for our Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems in the university. And you've got a field of wheat, and you've got some clouds and the atmosphere and the climate. And we live in this very thin atmosphere. We have to grow our food. We have to survive, and as we change the climate, then we change our ability to produce food, to feed us. For me, the crows are a harbinger of disease. That's one of the things that I work on, and if I get time towards the end, I'll talk just briefly about climate impacts on disease. No one mentioned the road. Well, this painting was painted in July 1890, the month at which Van Gogh died, and it's been interpreted as a road to nowhere. It wasn't the very last painting he painted, although sometimes it's attributed as such. But are we on the road to nowhere? Are we not going to change? Are we not going to act? And I think that's something that we will reflect on tonight. So just to credit the painting, wheat field with crows. So somebody was very, very close to the title there. So I've already been introduced. I kind of worked on the title. So it's the Liverpool Climate Crisis Forum, and I've got 12 years to save the planet. But we have to be a little bit careful with using that. It's a great rallying cry. I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the start saying why you should be careful. I'm also a founding member of Health Earth, where we're trying to look at holistic impacts of climate change on society. At the moment, like many startup organisations, we're struggling with funding, but we're trying to look at everything, and particularly look at those social impacts and to train people. So I'm very much coming from that sort of base. So let's start about the 12-year stuff. I want you to think about why you remember some things, particularly iconic pictures, and how we can make the issues of climate change into those iconic pictures that people won't forget, that they will take home and they will act upon. How do you trust the information that's out there? We've talked a lot, or you've heard a lot about false news, and I'll give you some hints of where you may want to go and read things. I'll bring you up to date with what we know about the current climate system, and then just towards the end, I'll talk a bit about our own climate variability, because there's lots of discussion about climate change and climate variability, and they often get lumped together, but they are connected. And as I said, if we get time, I'll show you just 3 slides, and only one of them from my actual research. So, already mentioned, climate strike. Greta Thunberg started the strike for climate, and I think the points that were already made, I don't need to go back over, but it was great to see the younger generation, I don't say that in any bad way, but actually out there and protesting with some great slogans. So hopefully they won't, when they grow up, or grow up more, forget about what they did when they were at school and will continue to be active in those areas. So what have we done? Well, we haven't done a lot. If you look at the global carbon dioxide emissions last year was probably, it rose again, and probably the largest output on record, I think, around 37 gigatons, nearly 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And the amount of emissions had dropped back for a while, but now increase again. There was information that came out this afternoon that Britain's own emissions actually dropped again last year. And we're quite a long way now behind the peak year, but Britain's a relatively small contributor, these days at least, to total carbon dioxide emissions. The carbon brief in April 2018 suggested to stay below 1.5 degrees C, which is a best estimate, I think, of a total emission of about 416 gigatons of carbon dioxide. We only have 10 years at current rates of emission. But I've got some other data. The problem about reading around in this subject, you'll find there's different estimates and different figures from everyone that you read. This was an interesting piece by Miles Allen, who's a professor at the University of Oxford, who I know, and he was an author on the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Special Report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees. And this article, if you look it up, is on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. And I wonder if anyone in the room knows what they're famous for, what they have on their website. Right? Okay. Anyone heard of the Doomsday Clock? So these are the group that have the Doomsday Clock. And do you know what the time is on the Doomsday Clock? How many minutes to midnight? I couldn't do that if I tried. It's 2 minutes to midnight. Mostly driven by the risks of climate change, overpopulation and other areas. Now Miles is cautious because a lot of people picked up on this bandwagon. We have 12 years before we reach 1.5 degrees C if we fail to act, and so on and so forth. And he is cautious because it may not happen in 12 years. If you take the highest estimate of the current warming, and if you take the highest estimate, the total warming so far since pre-industrial times, and if you take the highest estimate of the warming rate, then we are looking at reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial value, somewhere between 2030 and 2015. If you take the highest rate, as said, then you are looking at something happening maybe in the next 12 years. So why you've got to be really careful is that with the deniers, if in 12 years' time we don't reach that 1.5 degrees C, which we're all talking about and saying we will reach, they'll use it against us. So you have to be slightly cautious. It's a great rallying cry, but you just have to be slightly cautious. Some other points in Miles's piece of writing, that we're currently reducing carbon emissions. The projected decline in emissions is about 2 gigatons of carbon per year on an annual basis. If we go at that rate, then I think it's going to take us about 20 years to reach net zero. And that assumes that we can reduce at that rate and retain that rate of reduction. At the moment, we're picking off what the people like to call the low-hanging fruit. And it will get harder to maintain that rate of reduction as we go into the future. We've got about a 20-year job here, or probably longer, until we can get down to zero net carbon emissions. And I think at the end, Miles makes this point, particularly that intergenerational point about climate change. Yeah, for each year that we really don't act, then we add another 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide and leave it to our children and grandchildren to have to artificially remove from the atmosphere if they want to maintain a global temperature of 1.5 degrees C. Carbon dioxide, half of it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what we're putting in today, half of it will be here for another millennium. So, anyone recognise any of those pictures? Famous person from Liverpool, Yvonne. And if you went down to the exhibition in the World Museum last year, you would have seen similar ones. And you may remember the famous kiss, or one of the famous kisses in various photographs. So we remember those things. Everyone recognises them. And I kind of reflected on what would John Lennon be doing today. Well, he may well have been campaigning against climate change. And in fact, there is some evidence that Yoko Ono has been at least campaigning against fracking. So we saw those sort of very strong movements against war in the 60s and into the 70s, and perhaps you'll argue it's still happening. But we need to see that mobilisation into people acting against climate change risks. And can we make, the emphasis on moving to green energy and reducing our carbon footprint into an equally memorable picture? I don't think there is one yet, but that's what we have to do. We have to get this information out in a way that people don't forget, and they remember, and something triggers them to act. So, who do you trust? Do you trust the politicians? Do you trust the scientists? Has anyone heard of Richard Lindzen? No? You're lucky. Sorry. So you know this gentleman? Yeah, he gets really excited when they have a cold snap in the US and says there's no global warming. You remember him?
Oh, yes.
He's also a very famous climate denier, Dominic Lawson, the Chancellor of the Exchequer during the Thatcher years. Any boos and hisses, but never mind. Richard Lindzen's quite a well-known atmospheric scientist who was really quite a good scientist, but he's gone to the other side. He's now in the payment of various oil, gas, probably coal companies, and he testifies to our own House of Parliament. So you have to be careful, you can't always trust the scientists. Do you know this person? Who's heard of the hockey stick? Yes, it's Michael Mann. It's Mike Mann, Penn State University, who was the first person to really talk about the hockey stick from his climate reconstructions, taking the climate back in the past from tree ring records. And I've met Mike several times and worked with people in his department. So get in your mind that hockey stick that's temperature, or it can be other things, just going up. So time starts over here, I'm doing it in reverse for me, so it's the right way around for you. And it goes up, and it sharply goes up. So try and get that in your mind. Oops, I didn't want to press that one. Try that again. There are really some good articles out there. Carbon Brief, I had something mentioned in Carbon Brief today. The Conversation, which is a place where academics write papers that should be accessible. Climate Reality Project, and also Yale Climate Connections. And that's not an exhaustive list, but they're all good places to look for sensible information. The conversation is not always about climate, it can be on anything. So, talking about that sort of hockey stick, this runs through from 1880 to 2018, and it's looking at the anomalies, that's a difference from the long-term average, in global temperatures. This is a US-derived set of data, and you can see it's a little bit small, I'm afraid, but you get into the... put my glasses on, it's too small for me to see, you might see better than me. But you get to about 1980 here and things really start to take off. So the average here is based on the 20th century, so it's a very long average, but you can see how things have taken off in most of our lifetimes. Yeah, we're only going back to 1980, it's not that long ago. UK or Central England temperature goes back even further, reconstructed back to about 1659 from very early records. And you can see a similar pattern with this takeoff somewhere in the 80s. And it warmed, it's much, much warmer than any other point on the record. What's causing that? Well, it's the release of greenhouse gases. This is the longest instrumental carbon dioxide record in the world, known as the Keeling curve. Measurements made on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, well away from pollution sources, and we went through that arbitrary, but I think, whoops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button somewhere there. Went through that arbitrary 400 parts per million, about a couple of years ago. You can see the seasonal cycle on the CO2 trace, the drawdown because of the living biota here in the northern hemisphere. It's at this minimum point in the year, somewhere in the autumn. It's at about its maximum point around now, as we're coming out of the long northern winter. Unfortunately, there's not so much land mass in the southern hemisphere, and hence we see this annual fluctuation. If you go back, I've been teaching in Liverpool University since 1988, and it was only around about 345 parts per million then. This is one graph I have to update nearly every 6 months, because it changes and it continues to rise. How many people have seen the Keeling curve before or recognise it? Some of you? Okay. It's a nice animation. It doesn't completely go up to the current day, but you can see the seasonal cycle. So it's the CO2 again from Mauna Loa, and it starts about 2007. So unless anyone here that's 12 or more, you certainly contributed to that increase on the graph. And half of all the carbon dioxide ever released has been released in the last 30 years. So that's been released around the same scale of time as the first IPCC report that came out in 1990, which I think is a worrying thought. And there are other ways of showing changes. I have to go forward and back to make this one play. Oops. Ed Hawkins at University of Reading has these really wonderful temperature spirals. And you can see it's got the 1.5 and the 2 degree red circles on there. And you can see how close we've come already to 1.5 degrees in certain months. Obviously averaged over the whole year, we haven't reached 1.5 degrees C yet, but you can see how that's accelerated. No one here is from the 1920s, I assume. Might be. But then we're coming into our life span, and then into the more recent times. You can see how quickly that warming is accelerating. This slide's a little bit complicated, but I like it because it tells us how much carbon we've released. So that's how much carbon dioxide in gigatons of carbon since 1870 along the bottom. And then you can see how that affects the change in temperature. We're about here. If you go up to 1.5 degrees, we haven't got very much left to release. We've done most of that warming. And we have to act very, very quickly. Right, so let's look at some other things that are going on. Global plastic production since 1950 has a strikingly similar shape. And much of the increasing carbon dioxide is due to our activity and our consumption. And I think, again, the whole plastic and plastic in the oceans is getting good publicity. Population, the thing that most people don't talk about. Perhaps there's some debate that we will never reach 10 billion people, that we will start to see the population drop halfway through the century, but that consumption is driven by the population and driven by, on the whole, the population getting richer and consuming more. Where's the heat going? Well, actually, most of it, thank goodness, doesn't go into the atmosphere. 93.4% goes into the ocean. And this is why we're seeing the impacts on the barrier reef. The Great Barrier Reef is probably no more. Why we're seeing the impacts on fisheries. So the oceans maybe can't take much more heat, and then we start to transfer more of the heat into the oceans. The ocean, because it absorbs so much energy, and that's the heat content in the top 700 metres of the ocean. So lots of heat has gone into the ocean. Okay, I think we can skip that. I really like this way of showing how the British climate is changing. Done by Neil Kay at the Met Office, based on the original idea again by Ed Hawkins from Reading. This might shock you. The top one is sunshine, going from dark grey at the bottom number of hours to bright yellow at the top, and it's getting sunny, more sun. The middle one perhaps doesn't surprise you so much. That's temperature, and you can see that most of the warm years have been certainly this century, certainly since 2000. And then the other one that perhaps again is not so surprising, but the bottom one's rainfall. And you can see that they call it teal, the dark blue, are the wettest years, and the browns are the driest years. So 1976 is here as a marker, for those of you that remember it, like me. It's getting wetter. It's getting sunnier, hotter, and wetter, all at the same time. And if we go back to last year, this is the Central England temperature again, you can see that when we had the beast from the east, which was this first dip here followed by the second one, you can see that we were down. This is the minimum temperatures found in the 250-year record. We approached the minimum temperatures ever seen. If we skip forward to this year, that warm spell we had in February also broke records, and it was around the warmest years on record. So on top of the long-term climate change that seems to be affecting certainly temperature, in the UK it seems to be getting wetter, we also have this natural variability that's due to processes in the atmosphere which may or may not themselves be affected by climate change. My parents-in-law flooded twice in Carlisle and over a period of 10 years in a house that has never known to flood. And we had floods also throughout northwest England, but also into York and into Manchester. And this is showing you how much wetter than average December 2015 was. Last summer was very hot. Maybe 2 or 3 degrees above average. Don't know why it does that. 2 degrees above average for much of, from here south really. And everywhere was warmer than average, and it was dry as well. I can't really remember last year. It seems a long time ago, but it was a good summer, yeah? In fact, it was probably the warmest, for England, it was probably the warmest summer on record. And it was certainly in the top 3. And if you look at the top 4, and they declared it to be joint warmest, and it's ranking alongside 2006, 2003, and 1976. So the 3 out of the 4 hottest summers in England and Wales, at least, have been this century. Just very quickly at the end, if I have time, I work mostly on the impacts of climate on disease, and work mostly with mosquitoes. And this came from Gates Notes, from Bill Gates' blog. And mosquitoes kill about 830,000 people a year. But we have this sort of irrational fear of sharks. Yeah, you're all scared of sharks, aren't you? They kill 6 people a year. We're also good at killing each other, of course. 580,000 homicides and war. But then road traffic accidents, that's just really cheer you up. 1.25 million, and cancer deaths, 9.6 million. So I work on mosquitoes. Started off by working on malaria, transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. It's transmitting a parasite. Part of its life cycle is in the mosquito, which is driven by the local climate, and part of its life cycle is in the human. And before we even work on climate change, which I'm not going to show you, you have to be very careful working with climate data sets because they're all slightly different. And this is the contemporary climate. This is Kenya. It's a contemporary climate looking at the annual cycle based on about 10 to 15 years of data here. And whilst the patterns are similar, they are subtly different. And each of those data sets could be seen, at least the first 4, the top 3 and the one on the left here, could also be seen as reference data sets. They all have subtle differences, they also have different spatial scales. So, how do we change things? That's a job for you. I can help, but look how many scientists there are. Look at how many people there are. So what we have to do is get you to go out, persuade your friends to change the way that they do things. And I first put this slide together speaking to a group of artists, because I think communicating the message through art and not through boring science talks is a really important way to go. Even Billy Bragg sings about the king tides, the highest tides because of the rise in sea level that now inundate parts of Florida and other parts of the US. I am a climate optimist. I think there's no point being over pessimistic, but only if we can action the change. We can only be optimistic if we can go out and change the way we do things. I thank you for your attention, and I'll pass back to the chair.